Hanzhou came to the translation volunteer site purely because it was on his way. The International Translation Aid Program he sponsored was holding an event at the West City Convention Center. The organizers had invited their biggest benefactor to make an appearance. He'd planned to skip it, but his secretary said it would only take 5 minutes for a photo. He reluctantly agreed. The place was packed. Volunteers, refugees, international organization staff, all crammed together, noisy as a vegetable market. Hanzhou stood at the edge of the VIP lounge, waiting expressionlessly for the coordinator to come find him. His gaze drifted idly across the crowd, then stopped at a corner point. Two small figures were huddled there. A boy around 7 or 8, clutching a little girl of about 3 or 4, wrapping her in his thin jacket. The girl's face was buried in his chest, her small shoulders trembling either from cold or from crying. The boy kept his head down, patting her back over and over with his small hand. Whispering something in English under his breath, Hanzhou frowned and walked up close. He could see the children's condition clearly. The boy was thin, wearing a hoodie clearly several sizes too big. The cuffs frayed. His face was dirty, but his eyes were exceptionally bright, carrying a vigilance and composure beyond his years. The little girl in his arms had 2 lopsided pigtails. Her face was pale and bloodless, her lips purple from cold. She wore an equally worn little jacket. When the boy saw someone approaching, he instinctively pulled his little sister closer. He looked up. Hanzhou was habitually cold, but faced with 2 children shivering in a corner, he softened his voice anyway. "What's wrong?" The boy studied him for a few seconds, as if judging whether this man could be trusted. Then he relaxed his grip on his sister slightly and gestured at the girl in his arms. His Chinese was fluent but accented. "Little sister is cold. No blanket. Sir, can you give me a baby blanket? I'm afraid she'll freeze." When he said sir, his voice was clear and crisp, with that particular nasal tone of childhood. Hanzhou hadn't paid much attention at first, but just as the boy finished speaking and looked up, the convention center's overhead lights caught his face. Hanzhou could see his features clearly. Round, almond-shaped eyes, a straight, delicate nose, thin lips, soft jawline. That face looked almost exactly like someone he knew. Hanzhou's pupils contracted sharply. His breath caught for a moment. He stared at the boy's face, his fingers unconsciously tightening on his knees. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice much deeper than before. The boy, unsettled by the sudden change in his expression, stepped back slightly, but he answered politely anyway. "Haoran. Haoran." Hanzhou repeated the name. His Adam's apple moved. "And her little sister is Sunwan." Hanzhou's gaze moved from the boy's face to the girl's. At that moment, the little girl peeked half her head out from her brother's arms, looking at him timidly. Her eyes were big and round, tears still clinging to her lashes. In that instant, Hanzhou saw her features. They resembled his sister's younger self by at least 70 or 80%. His hands began to tremble slightly. Hanzhou had lived 33 years. He'd weathered more storms in the business world than he could count, but never had he been so at a loss. He took a deep breath and reached out his hand to Haoran. "Come with me. I'll take you somewhere warm." Haoran hesitated. He looked at his shivering sister, then at the large hand extended toward him. Finally, he gently took Hanzhou's index finger with one hand, holding his sister tightly with the other, and stood up. Hanzhou felt that small hand cold, thin, the bones prominent. Like a bundle of dry twigs, he led them to the VIP lounge. The heat was on full blast. His assistant quickly brought warm milk, blankets, and clean children's clothes. Hanzhou didn't let anyone else help. He wrapped the blankets around both children himself, then handed the warm milk to Haoran. After being wrapped in the thick blanket, Sunwan's shivering gradually stopped. She curled up in her brother's arms, sipping her milk in tiny sips, her eyelids growing heavier and heavier. Haoran patted her back, but he hadn't touched his own cup of milk. Hanzhou noticed this. He crouched down and asked, "Why aren't you drinking?" "Sister drinks first," Haoran said. "She hasn't eaten since yesterday." Hanzhou's heart felt like someone had squeezed it. He stood and had his assistant bring a bowl of hot porridge. Then he crouched in front of the 2 children again, meeting Haoran's eyes at eye level. "Haoran." It was the first time he'd called him by name. "Tell me, where are your parents?" Haoran's lashes trembled. He looked down at his sister, who was already half asleep in his arms. His voice was very, very small. "Mama died. Papa's gone. We were in a shelter. Then someone brought us out. Said they'd take us to a new home. I didn't trust them. I ran with my sister. He looked up at Shinhanjo. We came on a truck. I don't know where this is. I saw lots of foreigners and translators. So I came in. I can speak English. I can help them work. They'd give me and my sister food. Shinhanjo's throat tightened. He pulled out his phone from his suit's inner pocket and scrolled through his photos for a while until he found one he'd kept for years and never deleted. In the photo was a young woman in her early 20s, her hair in a ponytail, wearing a white shirt, smiling in front of a university gate. Her features were carved from the same mold as Sue Haoran's face. He held the phone out to Sue Haoran. Look, do you know this person? Sue Haoran stared at the screen for a long time. His eyes gradually widened. His lips trembled slightly. He looked up at Shinhanjo, his voice suddenly uncertain. Is this my mama? Shinhanjo closed his eyes. When he opened them again, a thin sheen of moisture had appeared in those usually cold, sharp eyes. He reached out and gently placed his hand on Sue Haoran's thin shoulder. His voice was so hoarse he could barely form words. Haoran, I'm your uncle, your mother's younger brother. Sue Haoran froze. He blinked those almond-shaped eyes so like his mother's, studying this tall, stern man in his suit. His little mind seemed to be trying to reconcile the concept of uncle with the image before him. After a few seconds, he asked quietly, aren't uncles supposed to be old men with white beards? Shinhanjo paused, and then for the first time in his life, outside of business negotiation smiles, he gave a real smile. His lips curved up, his eyes still red. That mix of smile and tears made this usually cold business titan look impossibly soft. That's your grandfather, he said, his voice trembling with laughter. I'm not that old yet. Sue Haoran watched him smile, and the tension in his expression finally eased a little. He looked down at his sister, fast asleep in his arms, then back up at this new uncle. His lips moved, and finally, he said softly, Uncle. Shinhanjo's Adam's apple bobbed. He reached out and gently, so gently, ruffled Sue Haoran's hair. As his fingertips touched that bristly little head, he felt something in his heart, something that had been empty for 5 years, finally settle into place. It had found its home. He'd been looking for this child for 5 years. After his sister passed away, he'd learned through contacts abroad that the children had been placed in the welfare system. He'd searched every channel, but there'd been no news. He'd even started to think he'd never see them again. And then today, at this translation site full of strangers, he'd crouched down and his nephew had called him sir. His assistant came in with the hot porridge and found Shinhanjo on one knee on the floor, head bent, speaking to a dirty little boy, eyes slightly red but lips curved. The assistant froze in the doorway, unsure whether to enter or leave. Shinhanjo straightened up and took the bowl of porridge. He handed it to Sue Haoran. Eat something. After you're done, I'll take you and your sister home. Sue Haoran took the bowl, looked down at it, then looked up at Shinhanjo. He set the bowl on the table beside them, then gently nudged his sleeping sister. Nwan, wake up. Eat a little before you sleep. Nwan blinked awake groggily, under her brother's coaxing. She managed a few sips of the porridge before falling back into a deep sleep. Only then did Sue Haoran pick up the bowl and eat himself. Small bites. Quick but careful, as if he'd learned from limited experience that you shouldn't wolf down food. Shinhanjo sat in a nearby chair, watching the 7-year-old boy carefully share the food he'd been given. Only after making sure his sister had eaten did he touch his own portion. He looked at that face so like his sister's in her youth, and at the understanding and restraint far beyond his years in those eyes. He clenched his fist gently. 5 years ago, on his sister's deathbed, her last phone call had said, Hanjo, can you find Haoran for me? Take care of him. He's the person I've worried about most my whole life. He'd been abroad handling an acquisition at the time. 3 days after hanging up, he'd received the news of her death. That promise had been like a thorn in his side for 5 years. Today, that thorn had finally been removed. Even though pulling it out after 5 years made his eyes sting, the moment it came free, light poured into every wound that had scarred over. Sue Haoran was sitting in this warm lounge, eating hot porridge, his sister in his arms, and his uncle was right there watching him. Shinhanjo pulled out his phone and sent his assistant a message. Look up a translator volunteer named Sun Yin. She was at the site today, the one who brought the 2 kids. Get me her information as soon as possible. Earlier, when he'd first arrived, his peripheral vision had caught a young woman crouched beside Sue Haoran and Sun Wan, speaking to them softly. Her tone was too warm for a volunteer, but more like someone taking care of her own children. Haoran had called her Jia, big sister. Naturally, that woman was young. Her eyes were clear and clean. When she'd crouched down to talk to Haoran, she'd reached out and tucked his wind-blown hair behind his ear. The gesture had struck something in Shun Hanzhou, a faint string in his chest. He pushed that unfamiliar feeling aside and turned back to Su Haoran. The boy had finished his porridge and was carefully wiping a grain of rice from his sister's mouth with a napkin. Clumsy but focused, Haoran, Shun Hanzhou began. That young woman who was talking to you earlier. Who is she? Su Haoran looked up, his eyes brightening. That's Sister Su Nian. She saved us. When I was being turned away at the entrance, she brought us in. She even warmed milk for me and my sister. She's a good person. When he said good person, his tone was emphatic, as if he were issuing the strongest guarantee imaginable for this sister of his. Shun Hanzhou watched his earnest little face and felt his lips curve again. All right, he said. We'll wait for her to come out, and we'll go together. Su Haoran nodded, pulling his sister closer. Nuan slept deeply, her face pressed to his chest, her mouth slightly open as she breathed. Haoran patted her back like a small animal guarding its young. Shun Hanzhou leaned back in his chair, watching those two small figures curled together. The cold in his heart was slowly being warmed by something. 5 years. He'd finally found them. And he'd found one more, a tiny one. His niece. That he wasn't alone anymore. Outside the lounge window, the crowd on the convention center square was gradually dispersing. Dusk was falling, and the streetlights were coming on. Shun Hanzhou's phone lit up. His assistant had sent over Su Nian's information, with a note attached. She adopted a girl 3 years ago. Modest financial means, but has refused all forms of assistance. That he stared at that message for 2 seconds, then locked the screen and put the phone back in his pocket. He turned his head, looking at Su Haoran and Su Nuan, and said in a low voice, "You'll never be cold again." When Shun Hanzhou brought the 2 children back to the Shin family estate, the butler, Uncle Chun, stood at the entrance. When he saw his employer get out of the car carrying a blanket-wrapped little girl and leading a thin little boy by the hand, he froze solid for a full 5 seconds. He'd worked for the Shuns for over 30 years. He'd seen Shun Hanzhou make ruthless business decisions. He'd seen him sit alone staring at his sister's photo. But he'd never seen him holding a child, sir. This. Uncle Chin's mouth opened and closed. My sister's children. Shun Hanzhou said simply, stepping aside to let Su Haoran enter first. Haoran, come in. This is your home now. Su Haoran stood before the massive carved bronze doors, looking up at the towering mansion. He clutched the hem of his shirt for a few seconds, hesitating. He glanced back at the black sedan in the driveway, then down at his worn-out jacket and dirty sneakers, as if measuring the gap between himself and this house. But Shun Hanzhou placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, and he stopped hesitating. He stepped inside. Uncle Chin quickly arranged rooms. The guest room, next to the master bedroom, facing the sun, was prepared for Haoran. The smaller room next to it was decorated as Nuan's little bedroom. Pink curtains, a soft wool rug, a cabinet full of brand-new stuffed animals. Anyone would think the family had been preparing for this for a long time. Su Haoran stood at the door of his sister's room, looking at the fluffy goose-down quilt on the bed. He reached out and touched the corner of the blanket, then turned to look at Shun Hanzhou. There was something in his expression that made Shun Hanzhou's chest tighten. It wasn't the excitement of a child seeing new toys. It was cautious testing. If confirming. Am I really allowed to touch this? Shun Hanzhou crouched down to his level. It's yours. And your sister's. Do you like it? Su Haoran nodded. He finally pulled the blanket a little closer. Nuan was still asleep, carefully placed on the new bed and tucked in by Uncle Chun. She was a tiny lump in the puffy duvet, like a flower bud yet to open, her little brow slightly furrowed as she slept soundly. Su Haoran stood by his sister's bed for a while, making sure her breathing was steady and peaceful. Then he turned and tugged at Shun Hanzhou's sleeve, whispering, "Uncle, can I see a picture of Mama?" Shun Hanzhou took him to the study at the end of the second-floor hallway. He didn't let anyone in this room. Even Uncle Chin only cleaned it when he was out. On the wall directly across from the desk hung a large framed photograph. In it, a woman in a white dress sat on a garden swing, smiling brightly. It was his sister Shin Qingtang at 22. Su Haoran walked up to the frame and looked for a long time. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his small hands at his sides. Shun Hanzhou stood behind him, watching his little head and the slight tremor in his shoulders. He said nothing. After several minutes, Su Haoran turned around. His eyes were red-rimmed, but he wasn't crying. He sniffled, looked up at Shun Hanzhou, and asked seriously, Did it hurt when Mama left? Shen Hanzhou paused. He crouched down, wiped the corner of Su Haoran's eye where a stray tear had escaped, and said softly, "No." She went peacefully. "She told me I had to find you." Su Haoran pressed his lips together and buried his face in Shen Hanzhou's shoulder. Shen Hanzhou felt those thin little arms circle his neck, their grip light and tentative. Slowly, he lifted his own arms and gathered this child, who had been holding everything together on his own for 7 years, into his embrace. That bony little body against his chest made him understand why his sister could never let go of this child. After a long moment, Su Haoran lifted his head. He rubbed his eyes, as if summoning all the courage he had left, and whispered, "Uncle, will you ever make me and Wan leave?" Shen Hanzhou looked at his red nose and those almond-shaped eyes so like his sister's. His Adam's apple moved. His voice was a little rough. "No, this is your home now. I searched for you for 5 years. I'm not losing you again." When Su Haoran heard this, he nodded hard, and then he smiled, a real smile that curved his mouth. It was Shen Hanzhou's first time seeing this child's genuine smile. It was tired and a little anxious, but the joy was real, lit up by the words, "This is your home." Small, fragile, brave at the same time. Sun Yin was leaving the translation site. It was almost 8. She handed in her final materials, rubbed her shoulders, and checked her phone. No new messages. Haoran and Wan had been taken away by that man in the suit. Before leaving, he'd left her a business card and said he was the children's uncle. She pulled out the card and looked at it again. Shen Hanzhou, CEO, Shen Corporation. She pursed her lips. Of course, she knew Shen Corporation. Half the city's commercial landmarks were connected to that name. But would Haoran and Wan fit in at a place like that? She wasn't sure. 3 years ago, while volunteering at a refugee shelter abroad, she'd met these 2 children. Wan had been just over a year old then, dangerously ill. Su Haoran had been 4, clinging to his sister in the corner, refusing to let anyone near. It had taken her 2 full months to convince him she wouldn't hurt them. Then she brought the 2 children back to the country, becoming their legal guardian, their sister in name, but mother in everything but blood. On her way back to her small rented apartment, Sun Yin's phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. Ms. Su, this is Shen Hanzhou. Haoran and Wan are settled. I'd like to discuss future arrangements with you. Mr. Shun. Sun Yin stopped under a street lamp, the night wind cool on her face. Thank you for taking them in today. But if you're thinking of taking the children away from me. No. He cut her off. I'm asking if you'd be willing to move in as well. Sun Yin froze. What? Haoran needs you. Wan even more. Shen Hanzhou's voice came steady and firm through the phone. I've looked into your situation. You've been raising Wan alone for 3 years. You don't have much, but you've taken excellent care of her. I'm not trying to separate you. I want you to move into the Shun house with them. Sun Yin's fingers tightened around the phone. Mr. Shun, I don't need charity. It's not charity. His voice softened suddenly, carrying a warmth Sun Yin hadn't heard before. It's a request. Haoran told me today that he wouldn't eat until Sister Sun Yin came back. He already sees you as family. I may be his uncle, but I can't replace the place you have in his heart. For the children's sake, will you consider it? Sun Yin stood in the night wind. The streetlight stretched her shadow long across the pavement. She looked down at her solitary outline, thought of Haoran's eyes, always wary, yet soft when they looked at her. And of Wan's sweet, sticky voice saying, "Sister, hold me." She closed her eyes and let out a long breath. I'll think about it. When she got back to her apartment, it was after 9. She'd barely pushed open the door when she heard rustling inside. She hurried in. On the living room floor sat a small pink suitcase. A little figure crouched beside it. Haoran was wearing brand new navy blue pajamas, his hair freshly washed and fluffy, carefully folding a small piece of clothing into the suitcase. Sun Yin froze. Haoran, how did you get here? Su Haoran turned at the sound of her voice. His eyes lit up when he saw her. He stood and ran toward her a few steps, then stopped, trying to maintain his "I'm grown up" composure, but the smile on his face gave him away. Uncle had his driver bring me. He said you'd be unsafe here alone. Sun Yin crouched down. She saw his clean little feet on the floor, toes curling nervously. She reached out and rubbed his head. Did your uncle send you to convince me to move? Haoran shook his head. No, I came myself. He said if you didn't want to come, he'd have me come see you every day. But I don't want you to be alone. He paused, picking at his fingers. Sister, come with us. Okay. Uncle's house is so big. There's a pink room for Wan, and a whole garden. You could plant flowers there. You said once you wanted a place to grow flowers. That Yunyan's nose suddenly stung. She hadn't expected this 7-year-old to remember something she'd mentioned in passing. She opened her arms and pulled Su Haoran into a hug, her chin resting on his soft hair. Her voice was a little choked. "Do you want me to come that badly?" Haoran nodded firmly against her chest. Then he looked up, meeting her eyes seriously. "Because you're my family. And my sister is too." Uncle said families should be together. Yunyan closed her eyes and kissed his forehead. She released him, stood up, looked at the little pink suitcase, then out the window at the distant lights. She picked up her phone and dialed the unfamiliar number. He answered quickly. "Mr. Shun, I'll move in, but I have conditions. Name them. I have a job. I can't quit. I need to come back to my apartment by 6 every evening to handle translation work. I'll be partly responsible for Haoran and Nuan's education. That you can't leave everything to hired help. And," she paused, her voice lowering, "if I feel it's not working out, I can take Nuan and leave at any time." There was a few seconds of silence on the other end. Then Shun Hanzhou's voice came through, softer than before, as if afraid of startling something. "The first 2 conditions. Agreed. The third." He paused. "You won't feel it's not working out." Yunyan gripped the phone. When she heard his last sentence, her heart inexplicably skipped a beat. She shook her head to push down that strange feeling, hung up, and looked down at Su Haoran, who was beaming up at her. She sighed and pinched his cheek. "Did your uncle send you to be his spokesman?" Haoran blinked innocently. "No, I'm here to help you move." He gestured at the pink suitcase. "I already packed for you. Your clothes are all inside. Your toothbrush too. And the book you always read." Yunyan looked down. Inside the suitcase, neatly folded, were her everyday clothes. Tucked in beside them was the collection of essays she liked to read before bed. She looked at this 7-year-old boy who had carefully packed for her and couldn't help laughing. She reached out and tweaked his nose. Su Haoran, you little traitor. He didn't flinch, just smiled and took her hand. "Let's go, sister. Uncle's driver is waiting downstairs." Yunyan let him lead her out. As she went down the stairs, she looked back one last time at the small apartment she'd lived in for 3 years. The gray walls, the narrow windows, the worn wooden floor. She'd spent countless winter nights there, wrapped in blankets, translating documents because the heating didn't work. She'd also spent many warm nights there, telling stories to a sleepy Nuan until she drifted off. She closed the door. A 7-year-old was holding her hand, leading her into a different life. The neon lights outside reflected their 2 silhouettes, one big, one small, stretching closer together in the night. As they got into the car, a thought struck Sun Yan. She turned to Su Haoran in his car seat. "Your uncle looks so intimidating. Aren't you scared of him?" Su Haoran thought seriously. "At first, a little, but today when he served me porridge, his hands were shaking. I saw his eyes were red. When he held me, he was so careful. Like holding something fragile." He looked up at Sun Yan, his tone certain. "He's not scary. He just doesn't know how to smile." Yunyan leaned back in her seat, watching the streetlights flash past the window. The image of that tall, composed man came to mind. Him crouching, his voice gentle when he spoke to the children. When she'd laid out her conditions on the phone, he'd listened quietly and agreed to each one without any annoyance. Nothing like the ruthless negotiator the rumors described. The car turned down a tree-lined boulevard. Ahead, the outline of a brightly lit mansion came into view. Sun Yan watched the carved bronze gates slowly open and took a deep breath. Su Haoran leaned over from his seat and patted her hand. "Don't be scared, sister. I'll protect you." Yunyan turned to his serious little face and couldn't help laughing. "You." Haoran puffed out his chest. "I'm 7. And," he lowered his voice conspiratorially, "my uncle is really powerful. With him around, no one will dare bully you." Through the window, Sun Yan could see a figure waiting at the entrance, silhouetted against the warm glow of the house. Her heart betrayed her with an extra beat. She took a deep breath, pushing down that inexplicable flutter, and unbuckled Haoran's seatbelt. "Come on," she said. "Let's go see how powerful your uncle really is." Yunyan's first night at the Shun estate was sleepless. To be precise, it was the bed. The cloud-soft mattress was a completely different species from the hard single bed in her apartment. She tossed and turned half the night, finally giving up and throwing on a coat to go downstairs for water. As she passed through the second-floor hallway, she noticed movement at the end of the corridor. The children's room door was ajar, a sliver of warm yellow nightlight spilling out. Yunyan pushed the door open gently. Su Haoran was lying across the edge of Nuan's bed, one arm tucked under the covers so his sister could hold his fingers. He was so tired his eyelids were drooping, his head nodding toward the pillow, but his grip on his sister's hand never loosened. Su Nian's heart ached with tenderness. She crept in, carefully lifted Haoran from the bedside, and carried him to his own bed, tucking him in. Half asleep, he felt the familiar motion and mumbled, "Sister," before rolling over and falling back asleep. She smoothed the blanket over him and was about to leave when she noticed a tall figure standing in the doorway. Shinhanzhou stood there in dark gray loungewear, his hair not as meticulously styled as during the day, a few strands falling across his forehead. It made him look much softer. He held a glass of water. Clearly having passed by and heard movement, they met eyes in the dim hallway light. Sun Yin felt a little uncomfortable under his gaze, which was unusually steady in the darkness. She nodded at him and headed back to her room as she passed him. Shinhanzhou spoke, his voice low so as not to wake the children. "Does Nuan wake up easily at night?" "Sometimes," Sun Yin whispered back. "She was traumatized before. She'll cry in the middle of the night sometimes. I just comfort her, and she's fine." Shinhanzhou nodded. Sun Yin noticed his thumb gently rubbing the rim of his glass, as if he had more to say. She waited, but when he didn't speak, she continued on her way to the end of the hallway. Just before she turned the corner, she glanced back. Shinhanzhou was still standing at the children's door, looking through the gap at the two sleeping figures. His silhouette in the night light was unusually still. Sun Yin watched him standing there alone and realized that this brightly lit mansion was actually quite empty. The next morning, Sun Yin woke to Nuan's soft cries. She threw on a jacket and ran into the next room. Shinhanzhou was already there. The CEO who commanded boardrooms was standing helplessly by the small bed, holding a crying Nuan in his arms with a stiff posture, as if holding something that might shatter. His face was a mask of "what do I do" confusion. Nuan's little face was scrunched up with tears. She reached out towards Sun Yin. "Sister, hold me." Sun Yin quickly took her, cradling her close and patting her back gently while humming a lullaby. Nuan's cries quickly quieted down to sniffles. Sun Yin wiped her face with her thumb and kissed her forehead. "Bad dream. It's okay. Sister's here." Shinhanzhou stood nearby, watching. His gaze moved from Nuan's reddened face to Sun Yin's gentle eyes, and lingered. After Sun Yin had calmed the little girl, she looked up and met his gaze. "What?" "Nothing." He looked away. "Breakfast is ready. Uncle Chin prepared what you like." Sun Yin blinked. "How do you know what I liked?" He was already walking out the door, not turning back. "I looked it up." Sun Yin held Nuan and stared at his back for a few seconds. Her ears were warm. He'd done his research on her pretty thoroughly, even down to what she liked for breakfast, the breakfast table. Su Haoran sat properly beside Shinhanzhou eating his porridge. Nuan was in her high chair, being fed egg custard by Sun Yin. Shinhanzhou ate quickly and quietly, but Sun Yin noticed that after he finished his own meal, he didn't leave the table. He just sat there looking at his phone, occasionally glancing at her wiping Nuan's mouth, or serving Haoran some vegetables. His expression was neutral, but she could tell he was paying attention. After breakfast, Shinhanzhou went to work. Sun Yin took Haoran to school. Shinhanzhou had already arranged enrollment at the best private elementary school nearby. Nuan was still small and stayed home with the nanny and Uncle Chun. That afternoon, when Sun Yin picked Haoran up from school, a woman stopped her at the gate. She was elegantly dressed and looked Sun Yin up and down, noting her simple clothes. Her smile was polite, but her tone was probing. "And what are you to Haoran?" "The nanny." Before Sun Yin could answer, Haoran stepped out from behind her, looked up at the woman, and smiled. "She's my sister, not the nanny." The woman's smile froze. She studied Sun Yin again. "Sister, I haven't heard of any relatives on the Shin side like that." Sun Yin didn't want to engage. She nodded politely and led Haoran away. In the car, after Haoran buckled his seatbelt, he turned to her. "Sister, when she said you were the nanny, did that make you feel bad?" Sun Yin paused, turning to look at his perceptive eyes. She reached over and ruffled his hair. "No, sister doesn't care what people say." Haoran didn't reply, but his small hands were gripping his backpack straps very tightly. That evening, after Shinhanzhou returned, Haoran followed him into the study. Sun Yin was passing by in the hallway when she heard low voices from inside. Curiosity got the better of her, and she crept closer. She heard Haoran's serious little voice. She said sister was just a nanny, and asked how someone like that was connected to the Shans. Shun Hanzhou's voice came through the door. And then sister took my hand and walked away. She was upset. She just didn't show it. Haoran paused. Uncle, sister is so good to us. Why do people look down on her? There was a pause from inside the study. Sun Yin pressed her back against the wall, her heart racing. Shun Hanzhou's voice came again, low and firm, something steadying about it. No one will ever say that again. Uncle promises. Sun Yin tiptoed back to her room. After closing the door, she leaned against it, patting her flushed cheeks. She looked down at the candy Haoran had given her that afternoon, its wrapper already crumpled from being half peeled. She unwrapped it and popped it in her mouth. Strawberry, sweet, but not cloying. As she sat on the bed, candy melting on her tongue, her phone lit up. A message from Shun Hanzhou. I'll take Haoran to school tomorrow. She replied. You don't have to. I can do it. He answered instantly. I'll take him anyway, she typed. Why not a long pause? Nearly a minute passed before he replied. So some people know Haoran has family. Sun Yin stared at the screen, the sweetness of the strawberry candy spreading through her chest. She hesitated before typing back a single word. Okay. The next morning, Shun Hanzhou drove Haoran to school himself. He parked in the most visible spot at the front gate, got out, bent down to straighten Haoran's collar, and took his hand as they walked in together from the back seat. Sun Yin watched their figures through the window. She saw the woman from yesterday pass by, and Shun Hanzhou turned slightly to acknowledge her with a brief nod. His expression was neutral, but the casual gesture carried an unmistakable declaration. This child is a Shun, and so is the person with him. Just before entering the school, Haoran glanced back toward the car and waved. Sun Yin waved back through the window. She noticed that Shun Hanzhou also glanced back, his gaze lingering on her longer than it had on Haoran. As the car pulled away toward the office, Sun Yin sat in the back while Shun Hanzhou's assistant drove. The silence stretched. Then Shun Hanzhou spoke. That woman from yesterday. She won't say anything more. Sun Yin looked away from the window. You're sure about that? Shun Hanzhou didn't answer. But in the rearview mirror, Sun Yin caught the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. So slight, like a crack in winter ice. There and gone in an instant. She looked down at her phone, but her heart was racing far too fast. His tone had been as calm as if he were discussing business, but every word he said felt like a declaration. She didn't dare examine what exactly it was declaring. When the car stopped at the office garage, Sun Yin grabbed her laptop and stepped out to head to her tiny translation workspace. She'd only taken a few steps when she heard footsteps behind her. Shun Hanzhou had followed her out. Sun Yin. She turned. He stood there, backlit by the light from the garage entrance, his features half in shadow, but his voice carried clearly to her ears. If anyone ever asks who you are, you can tell them you're Haoran and Wanwan's guardian. And if anyone has a problem with that, he paused. Tell them to come to me. Sun Yin opened her mouth, but all the practiced responses. It's fine. I can handle it. Got stuck in her throat. She looked at his expressionless face, at those calm, deep eyes. In the end, she just nodded, turned, and hurried to the elevator. When the elevator doors closed, she finally let out the breath she'd been holding. The mirrored walls reflected her red ears, and the smile she couldn't quite suppress. She clutched her laptop to her chest, watching the floor numbers tick up. The sweetness of that strawberry candy still lingered. What she didn't know was that Shun Hanzhou was still standing in the garage, watching her figure disappear behind the elevator doors. He pulled out his phone from his jacket and opened a folder labeled Sun Yin. Inside was all the information his assistant had compiled. Her family background, her education, her volunteer history, her adoption documents for Wanwan. The 3 hardest years she'd struggled through alone, never asking anyone for help. Yet she'd quietly reposted the Shun Corporation charity initiatives multiple times on her social media. He scrolled to the last page. It was a photo, taken on a snowy evening at the translation site. Sun Yin was crouched on the ground, holding Haoran's frozen little hands against her cheeks to warm them. Her eyes crinkled in a smile. Shun Hanzhou stared at that photo for a long time. Then he locked the screen, put the phone away, and walked into the elevator. As the car rose, the mirrored wall reflected his face. And that smile was a little more obvious than before. If anyone had seen him, they might have thought the CEO had just closed another major deal. Actually, it was nothing. He just thought that smile in the photo that he wanted to see it more often. On the 4th day after moving into the Shun estate, Sun Yin discovered a secret that made her deeply unsettled. It started simply enough. She was organizing translation files that afternoon when she accidentally opened a shared document that a family information form his assistant had compiled. She'd only wanted to check if Nguyen's vaccination records had been entered, but as she scrolled, her eye caught her own name. Nguyen froze. She clicked on the entry. The form listed her full name, birth date, address, employment, income history, and even a photo of her from last year's volunteer conference where she'd done simultaneous interpretation. At the bottom of the page was a note, in what she recognized as Shun Hanzhou's handwriting. 3 years of uncompensated care for non-biological child. No records of seeking assistance. Credit assessment. Excellent. Nguyen stared at that line for a long time. Her cheeks slowly puffed out. Credit assessment. What did he think this was? A background check for an employee. She closed the document, took a deep breath, and walked out of her workspace with her water glass. She passed the study and saw that the door was ajar. Shin Hanzhou was looking at something on his computer screen, wearing a pair of thin-rimmed gold glasses. He looked less severe than usual, more focused and scholarly. Nguyen knocked on the doorframe. Shin Hanzhou looked up and, seeing her, took off his glasses. What's up? Mr. Shun. She walked in, set her glass on his desk, and leaned forward slightly, hands on the edge. I have a question. That credit assessment form about me. Did you have someone make that? Or did you write it yourself? Shin Hanzhou's gaze moved from her face to her fingers on the desk, then back up. He didn't look the least bit caught off guard. Instead, he calmly folded his glasses and put them in the drawer, then leaned back in his chair to look up at her. I wrote it. Why? Sun Yin felt her ears growing hot. I'm not applying for a job with your company. Why did you investigate me so thoroughly? Shin Hanzhou looked at her eyes, bright with indignation, and was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he said something that made all her prepared objections die in her throat. Because Haoran sees you as his mother. I needed to know if the person who brought his mother back was trustworthy. Nguyen froze. Mother. He'd called her that. She opened her mouth to say she was just an older sister, but the words wouldn't come. For 3 years, she'd been their only support. Feeding them, comforting them, wiping their tears, telling them bedtime stories. She'd been doing far more than any sister would. Shin Hanzhou was simply stating a fact. Oh, what did you conclude? She looked away, her voice softer. Shin Hanzhou didn't answer immediately. He stood up and walked around the desk until he stood before her, only an arm's length apart. Sun Yin could smell his faint aftershave. Clean and crisp. She took a half step back, her lower back pressing against the desk's edge. Shin Hanzhou looked down at her flushed cheeks and said, very softly, I concluded I hit the jackpot. Sun Yin's head snapped up, but Shin Hanzhou was already walking toward the door, his back perfectly composed, as if he'd just commented on the weather. At the door, he glanced back. Uncle Chun made dumplings tonight. Your favorite. Chive and egg filling. Haoran said he wants to make them with you. The door clicked shut. Sun Yin stood there, hands over her face, cheeks burning enough to fry an egg. Hit the jackpot. Her mind echoed with that phrase. How could he say something like that in that tone? As if he were discussing quarterly reports. That evening, Sun Yin sat at the table making dumplings. Haoran had his sleeves rolled up, working the dough with impressive skill for a 7-year-old. Nguyen sat in her high chair, happily smashing a ball of dough with her little hands. Uncle Chun stood at the end of the table, folding dumplings at lightning speed. Shin Hanzhou sat at the other end, a small piece of dough before him. He was clumsily trying to seal the filling inside. Sun Yin glanced over and saw his lopsided dumpling that the skin had broken, and filling was spilling out, looking pitiful on the cutting board. Mr. Shun, she said, fighting a smile. You might want to redo that one. It's about to fall apart. Shin Hanzhou looked down at his creation. Unfazed, he said, it'll taste fine. It's leaking. If you boil that, it'll become soup. Shin Hanzhou set down the sorry dumpling, finally accepting defeat. He looked up at her, and that faint smile appeared again, with something almost like helplessness in it. Then teach me. Something about the softness in his voice hit a nerve, and Sun Yin's ears burned. She looked away, moved to sit beside him, took a fresh piece of dough, and demonstrated. Use less filling. Seal the middle first, then the sides. Even pressure. Shin Hanzhou followed her movements and made another one. It was still crooked, but at least it held together. Sun Yin leaned in to comment on his improvement, but when she looked up, his face was very close. He was looking down at the dumpling. She was looking up at his profile, barely a fist's width between them. She could count every eyelash. She jerked back to her own spot, grabbing a piece of dough to cover her fluster. Shin Hanzhou, seemingly unaware, placed his new dumpling neatly on the board beside its fallen comrades. Haoran looked up from his rolling, glanced at Su Nian's red ears, then at Shun Hanzhou's slightly curved lips. He sighed like a little adult and went back to rolling. When the dumplings were served, the whole house smelled of chives and egg. Wan was happily stabbing at a cold dumpling in her bowl, her face smeared with flour. Shun Hanzhou put 2 pan-fried dumplings in Haoran's bowl and casually slid the plate of steamed dumplings closer to Su Nian's side. She preferred them steamed, he'd found that out too. She looked at the steaming plate in front of her, picked one up with her chopsticks, and bit into it. The filling was perfect. Chives, egg, and a hint of dried shrimp. Exactly how she liked it. As she chewed, her nose suddenly prickled. She took another bite to cover it. This table, full of steaming food, children's chatter, the quiet presence of Shun Hanzhou sipping his soup. This mansion had stopped being cold the moment she'd moved in. That night, after Su Nian put Wan to bed, she passed by Haoran's room and heard low voices inside. She leaned closer. Shun Hanzhou's voice, low and steady. When you were in the shelter, did anyone ever tell you bedtime stories? Haoran's voice, heavy with sleep. No, I told myself stories. A pause. Then Shun Hanzhou cleared his throat, and in a stiff, halting voice, began. Once upon a time, there was a castle. In it lived a king, and his 2 children. Uncle, you're reading from a script, then make one up yourself? Once upon a time, there was a sister. She found a little brother and a little sister. She raised them. The brother said he'd grow up and make enough money to buy her a big house. The sister said she'd bake the sweetest cookies in the world for her. A pause. Then Shun Hanzhou's low laugh came through the crack in the door. Brief. Clear. What are you laughing at? Uncle. Nothing. Your story is better than mine. We'll tell that one from now on. Su Nian leaned against the hallway wall, still holding the hot water bottle she'd meant to give Haoran. She listened to the 2 voices, one low, one high. Talking softly under the nightlight. Her toes traced circles on the floor. She started to walk away, then turned back. In the end, she didn't go in. She went back to her room, lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, and typed a note on her phone. Haoran likes bedtime stories, ones with sisters in them. She stared at the line for a long time, then pressed the phone to her chest. That low laugh of his echoed in her ears, so different from his usual sternness, like an animal hiding in its shell. Finally peeking out to breathe, Su Nian rolled over and buried her face in the pillow. This mansion's coldness was probably beyond repair, because a child told a story about a sister here, and a man laughed quietly here, and she was lying just steps away, listening to those small sounds, and she felt like she was inside that story too. She picked up her phone and sent him a message. I'll make congee tomorrow morning. You don't have to have Uncle Chin prepare it. He replied immediately. Okay, your usual. Half white rice, half millet, with 3 red dates. Right. Su Nian glared at the screen. He'd really researched everything about her. She typed and deleted, and finally sent back. Exactly how many things did you look up in my file? A pause. Then 4 words. Everything I could. She buried the phone under her pillow, feeling like her ears could set the pillow on fire. She stared at the ceiling in the dark, but she couldn't suppress the smile on her lips. Tomorrow's congee would have extra red dates. She'd put 2 in his bowl. 2.2 weeks passed in a comfortable rhythm. Su Nian grew used to the routine of the Shun household, taking Haoran to school in the morning, spending the morning with Wan, picking Haoran up for lunch, doing translation work in the afternoon, gathering for dinner as a family. Shun Hanzhou always came home on time unless he had unavoidable meetings. He didn't talk much at the table, but he was never absent. Sometimes, when Su Nian worked late and past his study, she'd see his light still on. Everything was going well, until that weekend afternoon, when Shun Hanzhou's second uncle arrived with his entire family, by seniority. Shun Hanzhou called him second uncle. There had been 3 brothers in the Shun generation. Shun Hanzhou's father was the eldest, but had passed away early. Second uncle had always harbored resentment that believing the Shun Corporation should have gone to his branch of the family. Though he hadn't spoken openly since Shun Hanzhou took over, he'd quietly spread talk about outsiders running things. As soon as second uncle entered, his gaze went past Shun Hanzhou to the children playing with blocks in the living room. Su Haoran was building a castle, while Wan sat beside him on the rug, placing red blocks on top. They were so focused, they didn't notice the uninvited guests. Second uncle watched for a few seconds, then turned to Shun Hanzhou with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Third nephew. So this is the nephew you found. The one surnamed Su. Shun Hanzhou stood from the sofa, his expression unchanged. Second uncle, what brings you here today? Just passing through. Thought I'd see for myself. Second uncle sat down, his gaze still on Haoran. He spoke loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. I have to say, third nephew, that you're being foolish. It's bad enough letting outsiders manage the family business, but now you're bringing in children from other families. Your sister married into the Su family. Those children have nothing to do with the Shuns. Su Nian stood at the kitchen doorway, a fruit plate in her hands. Her fingers tightened at the words other families. Haoran heard them too. His small hand slowly lowered the block he'd been holding. He looked up toward the living room, and in his round eyes, she saw something she knew all too well, that wary discomfort of being classified as an outsider. Su Nian set down the plate and walked toward the living room. Before she could speak, a colder voice cut in. Second uncle. Shun Hanzhou stood in front of his uncle, looking down at the seated elder. His tone was flat, but the sharpness beneath the calm made the whole room feel colder. Haoran has the Su surname. Yes, but half of his blood is Shun. My sister entrusted him to me on her deathbed. He is my family. His surname doesn't matter. Second uncle was taken aback by the bluntness. His face darkened. You know nothing about what's best for the family. Bringing an outsider's child into this house, that what will people think of the Shuns? And two of them. He flicked a glance at the bewildered Wan. And where did this one come from? Found on the street. Third nephew. Have you been bewitched? Su Nian's heart clenched. She stepped forward instinctively, moving to stand in front of Haoran and Wan. Before she could speak, a hand gently pressed on her shoulder. Shun Hanzhou had moved beside her, subtly pulling her half a step behind him, blocking her from second uncle's view. Second uncle. His voice was moderate, but every word landed with weight. Haoran is my sister's flesh and blood. Wan is the sister my nephew chose. Starting today, they are Shuns. If I hear anyone call them outsiders again. He paused, slowly pulling out his phone. The screen showed an unsigned contract, with second uncle's company listed as the counterparty. The project financing you asked me to approve last month. Shun Hanzhou said. I haven't signed it yet. Second uncle's face went pale. Shun Hanzhou put the phone back in his pocket, his voice resuming its usual calm. I personally review every investment Shin Corporation makes. If I have concerns about a partner's suitability, project assessments can be affected. Don't you agree? The living room fell so silent you could hear a pin drop. Second uncle's face cycled through shades of white and red. His lips moved, but no words came. He stood abruptly, made a dismissive gesture, and left with his family. When the door closed, Su Nian finally exhaled. She looked down at Haoran, still behind her. The little boy was looking at Shun Hanzhou's back, eyes bright, his grip on the block loosening. Wan, oblivious to the confrontation, was still carefully placing a blue square on top of her castle. Su Nian looked at Shun Hanzhou. He'd already put his phone away and was bending down to repair a corner of Haoran's castle that had fallen. He was much better at stacking blocks than wrapping dumplings. His long fingers worked deftly, quickly restoring the structure. Uncle. Haoran ran over and tugged his sleeve. Shun Hanzhou looked down. You're amazing. Haoran said seriously. More amazing than all the grown-ups I've met before. Put together, Shun Hanzhou crouched down, pressing his hand lightly on Haoran's head. His voice softened. If anyone ever says those things again, you come to me. Don't be afraid. Haoran nodded. Then he stood on tiptoe and pressed a kiss to Shun Hanzhou's cheek. He was immediately embarrassed, his ears red, and ran back to his blocks. Shun Hanzhou stayed crouched for a moment, the tips of his ears betraying a pink flush. Su Nian watched the whole thing, unable to stop smiling. She brought the fruit plate to the coffee table and gave Haoran and Wan their pieces, then moved to stand beside Shun Hanzhou. Thank you, she said quietly. He straightened up and looked at her, because she'd moved to shield the children, and he'd moved to shield her. They were standing close enough for her to see the coldness in his eyes slowly melting. You don't need to thank me, he said. You stood in front of Haoran. You did what you should. Su Nian's ears burned again. She pretended to reach for fruit, and heard him add, next time, stand behind me. Why should I stand behind you? She asked, a strawberry halfway to her mouth. Shun Hanzhou looked at her, that faint smile reappearing. Because I'm taller. I can shield you better. She had no comeback. She popped the strawberry into her mouth and chewed aggressively, across the room. Haoran was building blocks while stealing glances. When he saw Su Nian's red ears and Shun Hanzhou's faint smile, he shook his head like a little adult and pulled Wan closer. Sister, he whispered. Uncle is teasing her again. Nuan vaguely glanced up, then went back to her blocks. She was too young to understand adult tension. But her brother had already pieced it together and made a mental note. Uncle likes sister. That night, after putting Nuan down, Sun Yin returned to her room and found a box of strawberries on her nightstand. Under the box was a sticky note in Shun Hanzhou's sharp, angular handwriting. Today's were sour. These are sweet. She opened the box. Inside were perfectly arranged, plump red strawberries. Each one picked for size and quality. She bit into one. The sweetness burst on her tongue. She chewed slowly, then buried her face in her pillow and laughed for a long time. When she stopped, she picked up her phone and sent him. Received. Very sweet. He replied after a moment. I received mine too. She blinked. What did you receive? A pause. Then, your smile. I saw it from the hallway corner. Sweeter than the strawberries. Sun Yin stared at the screen for a full 5 seconds. Then she put the phone down and buried her face in the pillow again. This time, she was laughing so hard her shoulders shook. When she finally lifted her head, her hair was a mess, her eyes bright. She looked at the soft ceiling light and muttered, Shin Hanzhou, you're done for. She flipped her phone over and typed back. You were spying on me. He replied instantly. I was looking openly. She stared at those 4 words for a long time, then locked the phone, set it on the nightstand, and turned off the light. In the darkness, she stared at the ceiling, her smile impossible to suppress. She'd only been here half a month, and her life had already turned upside down. 2 children who treated her like a mother. A man who said he'd hit the jackpot. A box of strawberries left at her bedside in the middle of the night. Messages typed and deleted and typed again. She pulled the covers up to her chin and smiled in the dark. Shin Hanzhou. She whispered his name. Moonlight spilled through the window, falling on the strawberries. Bright red, wrapped in a soft glow, like unspoken words waiting for her to taste. Life settled into a gentle rhythm. Sun Yin began to think of the Shun estate as her home. Uncle Chun would leave the entry light on when she came back late. Every day after school, Haoran ran to find her first, reporting what he'd learned. Nuan's vocabulary grew daily, and she loved to whisper in Sun Yin's ear, Sister smells good, and giggle. And Shun Hanzhou. Sun Yin noticed a habit he probably thought she didn't see. No matter when he came home, a glass of water would be on the mat outside her door. Cool in summer, warm in winter. She'd never told him she got thirsty at night, but he seemed to know, placing one there day after day. Sometimes, when she worked late, she'd open her door to find the glass still warm, and she wondered when he'd put it there. One Friday night, Sun Yin picked up an urgent translation job. A migrant worker had been in an accident and sent to the hospital. He couldn't communicate in English and couldn't cooperate with treatment. The hospital had reached out to the volunteer translator platform. Sun Yin happened to be online and took it. Before leaving, she texted Shin Hanzhou. Got an emergency translation gig. Going to the hospital. Might be late. He replied quickly. Send me the address. It's fine. I'll take a cab. A pause. Then, she smiled at the ellipsis, picturing his reluctant expression, pocketed her phone, and left. The emergency room was bright, thick with the smell of disinfectant and blood. When Sun Yin arrived, she got to work immediately. The patient was a middle-aged man with a broken leg. Sweating from pain and panicking because he couldn't communicate, Sun Yin crouched by his bed, translating the doctor's diagnosis and treatment plan 1 sentence at a time, holding his cold hand to calm him. She stayed until all the tests were done and the family had been contacted. It was past 1 in the morning. She rubbed her sore neck as she stood up and noticed a blood stain on her coat sleeve from helping the patient turn over. She walked out of the ER into the cold night air. It hit her like a slap, and she shivered. She pulled out her phone and saw over a dozen missed calls, all from Shin Hanzhou. The last one was 10 minutes ago. She called back. It rang once before he answered. Where are you? His voice was tensed. At the hospital. I told you. Which hospital? She gave him the name. He hung up without another word. She stood at the entrance, confused, when a black sedan came screeching around the corner, tires squealing. It stopped sharply in front of her. The driver's door flew open, and Shun Hanzhou stepped out. He was in casual clothes with a coat thrown over them, his hair windblown. His gaze immediately landed on the dark stain on her sleeve, and his pupils contracted. Are you hurt? His voice was tighter than before. No. Someone else's blood. Before she could finish, she sneezed violently. The wind was cutting through her clothes, and she realized she'd lost all feeling in her hands and feet. Shun Hanzhou stared at her for 2 seconds. then bent down without a word and lifted her off the ground. Her body was suddenly airborne. Sun Yin gasped and instinctively grabbed his neck. His arms were solid, the warmth through his coat radiating against her. His jaw was clenched, clearly holding in a torrent of emotion. Wordlessly, he put her in the passenger seat and bent to buckle her seatbelt. She was still stunned by his rapid movements. When he got back in the driver's seat, she came to her senses. "Shinhanjo, you don't move." He started the car and turned the heater to full blast. Glancing at her, those dark eyes still holding traces of anxious tension. "Your hands are freezing. How long have you been cold?" She looked down at her pale fingers and tucked them into her sleeves. "Not that long." He didn't answer. He pulled a spare blanket from the back seat and dropped it in her lap, then accelerated into the night. Inside the car, silence stretched, just the hum of the heater and the soft sound of tires on pavement. Sun Yin wrapped the blanket around herself and looked at him. His driving was as steady as always, but his knuckles on the steering wheel were white. "Shinhanjo," she said softly. "Yeah. Were you worried?" His eyes stayed fixed on the road. His voice controlled. "You didn't answer 20-something calls, and you didn't tell me where you were. My phone was on silent." She checked her call log. Dense with his missed calls. From 11.30 to past 1.00. Almost one every 5 minutes. Something soft and heavy swelled in her chest. "You kept calling." "Yes." Her grip on the blanket tightened. She turned to look out the window. Her reflection showed ears bright red and a smile she couldn't hide. "You didn't have to come find me. I would have come back on my own." He cut her off. At a red light, he turned to look at her. His eyes calm and serious in the dim car light. "If you go out at night again, call me to pick you up. I can do it myself. I know you can." His voice was even, but every word carried unshakable certainty. "But I want to pick you up." The light turned green. He looked back at the road and drove on. Sun Yin sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in his blanket, feeling like her heart was about to hammer out of her chest. She opened her mouth to find words, to break this overwhelming moment, but her mind was blank. She buried her face in the blanket instead. When they arrived back at the estate, it was nearly 2. Uncle Chun had left the entry light on. The house was quiet. Sun Yin tiptoed inside, about to head upstairs, when Shinhanjo's voice came from behind. "Wait." She turned. He'd gone to the kitchen and emerged with a glass of warm milk, holding it out to her. The warmth seeped into her cold fingertips. "Drink this first," he said. She looked at the milk, silent for 2 seconds, then drank it slowly. The warm sweetness slid down her throat, spreading warmth all the way to her feet. She handed the empty glass back, looking at him in the soft light. In his loungewear, he looked so much gentler than during the day, his hair falling across his forehead, his eyes darker in the dimness. "Shinhanjo," she said, her voice softened by the warm milk. "Yet I don't go driving around looking for me in the middle of the night. I'll worry about you getting into an accident." He looked at her flushed cheeks, and the lamplight reflected in her eyes. The smile came again, clearer than before. He made a soft sound of assent, raised his hand, and very lightly tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His fingertip brushed her earlobe, and she went completely still. "Go to bed," he said, his voice low. "I'll tell Uncle Chin not to wake you tomorrow." She nodded, turned, and went up the stairs. After 2 steps, she glanced back. He was still standing there, holding the empty glass, watching her go, her heart hammering. She whispered, "Good night, good night." She hurried to her room, closed the door, and slid down to sit on the floor. She pressed her hands to her burning face, trying to calm her breathing. After 2 minutes, she pulled out her phone and sent him a message. "You should sleep early too. No waiting up for me." He replied instantly. "Then come home before midnight." She stared at the message, realizing he'd turned it back on her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Are you making a deal with me?" A beat. Then, "I'm negotiating with you." She stared at those 4 words and finally broke into laughter. She buried her face in the covers, shaking with it. When she resurfaced, she looked at the ceiling, then at his message again. She typed, "Deal," then added, "But you have to help Haoran with his math homework. He's falling behind." He replied, "Deal." She set the phone on the nightstand, turned off the light, and pulled the covers up. In the dark, she replayed the feeling of his fingers brushing her ear. Brief, light, but burning on her skin. She turned, face in the pillow, muffling a laugh. Lights in the mansion went out one by one, but in the 2 rooms across the hallway from each other, phone screens still glowed, separated by a wall, by the night, by all the words not yet said. The warmth of that milk spread from her stomach, heating her whole body. She drifted off in a pleasant haze. Her lips curved. What she didn't know was that on the other side of the hallway, Shin Hanzhou sat in his study, a document in front of him, his pen motionless on the page. He stared out the window at the moonlit garden, thumb absently stroking the edge of his phone. The screen was still lit with his assistant's latest file. Sun Yan, Volunteer of the Year. 3 years ago. In the photo, she stood on stage in a simple white sweater, holding a certificate. Smiling shyly and earnestly, he enlarged the photo and looked at it for a long time. Then he locked the screen and set the phone down. Closing his eyes, she had taken in his family. She had warmed the house that had been cold for 5 years. She had turned this mansion into a place where someone was waiting at the door, where warm milk was left by the bed, where someone said good night that he wanted to repay her. For a lifetime, Sun noticed Haoran was acting strange. Specifically, the 7-year-old had developed an unusual interest in who picked him up from school. Before, he'd always been happy when she came. Now, every time he walked out of school, his first move was to peek behind her, as if looking for someone. When she asked what he was doing, he'd shake his head and say, nothing. Then he'd get in the car obediently. It wasn't until one evening at dinner that Haoran put down his chopsticks and said to Shin Hanzhou with extreme seriousness, Uncle, can you pick me up tomorrow? Shin Hanzhou paused mid-reach. Isn't Sister Su picking you up? Yes. Haoran said quickly. Then he hesitated, looking down at the tablecloth. But that art teacher, Mr. Zhou, he keeps asking me to stay after class to clean up the supplies. Then he talks to Sister Su when she comes. He said her hair looks nice. Sun Yan nearly choked on her soup. She grabbed a napkin and dabbed her mouth. Haoran, that's just being polite. Haoran looked up with a you can't fool me expression. He touched your hand yesterday. He said, Sister Su, your hands are so soft. I saw it. Shin Hanzhou slowly set down his chopsticks. 3 seconds of silence fell over the table. Sun Yan felt the pressure drop beside her and didn't dare look at him. She just focused on her rice that he was just helping me with a pen because my hands were full. It was an accident, she said, flustered. Don't exaggerate. Haoran made a skeptical sound and went back to eating. But Sun Yan saw, from the corner of her eye, a slight tension in Shin Hanzhou's jaw. Then he picked up his phone, expression unchanged, and swiped a few times. The next afternoon, Sun Yan went to pick up Haoran as usual. As she came out of the school gate, she saw a familiar black sedan by the curb. The window rolled down, revealing Shin Hanzhou's expressionless face. Sun Yan blinked. What are you doing here? I'm not busy today. He got out, taking Haoran's backpack from her hand, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Haoran's eyes lit up. Though he tried to maintain an I knew you'd come composure, he tiptoed over to Shin Hanzhou and took his hand. They were heading to the car when a young man ran out from the school gate. Sister Su. Wait. About that color scheme you asked about. Sun Yan turned to see the art teacher jogging up with a sketchbook in hand. He smiled as he approached. Then his gaze fell on the tall, silent figure behind her. His smile faltered. This is he's my uncle. Haoran answered before anyone else, looking up at the teacher. His tone carried that particular gravity of a child claiming territory. He's also my sister's. He paused. He wasn't sure what to call the relationship. Uncle was uncle, sister was sister. But they'd been sitting together in the living room reading at night lately. And Sun Yan had been putting extra dates in Shin Hanzhou's porridge. Family. He finally settled on. Shin Hanzhou looked down at Haoran, the corner of his mouth twitching. He stepped forward and, with perfect naturalness, placed his arm around Sun Yan's shoulders. Sun Yan froze. She turned to stare at him, but he was looking at the teacher, his tone polite and distant. Hello? I'm Shin Hanzhou. He paused, glancing down at Sun Yan as if to confirm something, then looked back at the teacher. My wife's hands aren't really available for others to touch. Sun Yan's heart slammed against her ribs. She could feel the warmth of his hand on her shoulder through her thin shirt. She wanted to say, when did I become your wife? But at this point, if she contradicted him, the teacher's expression would be more than just awkward. The teacher's face cycled through white and red. He stepped back, flustered. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Sister Su. You didn't mention. I'll be going. Then he hurried back inside. Clutching his sketchbook, the school gate fell quiet. Spring wind stirred, scattering cherry blossom petals across the pavement. Sun Yan took a breath and glared at Shin Hanzhou. Who's your wife? He moved Haoran's backpack to his other hand, finally dropping his arm from her shoulder. Looking at her, he said without a flicker. Sooner or later, Sun Yan was so stunned she felt all her blood rush to her head. Her ears burned. Haoran looked up at both of them, then kicked a pebble. Unable to hide his I knew it expression, "Get in." Shinhanjo opened the back door for her. She climbed in. Head down. Haoran climbed up beside her, buckling his seatbelt skillfully. He leaned close and whispered, "Sister, I helped chase that teacher away. Didn't I?" She looked at his cunning almond-shaped eyes, like his uncle's, and flicked his forehead. "You little traitor." Haoran clutched his forehead and leaned back. But he was smiling. Shinhanjo got in the driver's seat and glanced in the rearview mirror. Sun Yin was red-faced, fussing with Haoran's collar. Haoran sat still, letting her fuss, mumbling, "Sister, your face is really red today." He looked away, the corner of his mouth curving in a smile no one could see, and drove off. That night, after putting Wan down, Sun Yin passed the study and saw the door was ajar. Shinhanjo was on the phone inside. She was about to walk on when she heard his voice. "Yes, move all afternoon meetings to after 4. I need to pick up the kids at 3. The person on the other end must have asked something." Shinhanjo paused, then said that with a barely perceptible smile she'd never heard before, "Yes, I'll be picking them up from now on. I'm afraid someone might steal my spot." Sun Yin pressed herself against the wall, hearing every word. She pressed her face into her palms, smothering a laugh. Then she tiptoed back to her room, face down on the bed. She sent him a message. "You don't have to pick him up tomorrow. I'll do it." He replied fast. "Afraid you'll get hit on." She stared at those words. Her fingers trembled as she typed. "Shinhanjo, you're so childish. Just stating a fact." That teacher was being social. Normal socializing. There was a pause. Then she received a voice message. She held it to her ear and heard his low voice in those few seconds. "I don't care if it's normal socializing. I'm jealous." The 2 words came with a directness that was impossible to evade. She pressed the phone to her chest, staring at the ceiling, feeling her heart racing. She turned, face in the pillow, laughing silently. Then she picked up the phone and sent a voice message. "Shinhanjo, can you ask me next time before you get jealous?" She thought it sounded strange even as she sent it. But before she could delete it, he'd replied. She played the message. His calm voice, but with laughter he couldn't hide. "If I asked, you'd probably say yes. So it's more efficient to skip the question." Sun Yin stared at the screen, face hot enough to cook an egg. She typed and deleted, finally sending a row of ellipses. He sent one back, across the hallway. 2 phones, 2 people, smiling at their screens in the middle of the night. Moonlight spilled across the floor. Night wind stirred the curtains. Everything was quiet except for 2 hearts about to burst. Sun Yin put the phone aside and turned off the light. In the dark, she stared at the ceiling, unable to stop smiling. A thought struck her. She'd never asked Shinhanjo what exactly he meant by sooner or later. Whether it was a proposal, a wedding, a confession, or just him making her jealous one day. She turned over, wrapping herself in the covers. She'd ask him over breakfast tomorrow. But she probably wouldn't get a word in before he distracted her with her favorite foods. That man was far too clever. Late Wednesday night, Sun Yin was jolted awake by a thin, quiet crying. She sat up, orienting herself. The sound was coming from Haoran's room. She threw on her jacket and hurried over, finding him curled under the covers, face flushed, mumbling something feverishly. She touched his forehead, burning. "Haoran, Haoran." She patted his cheek, trying to wake him, but he was deep in fever, repeating a phrase in a broken whisper. "Mama, don't go. I'll be good." Her heart cracked. She gathered him in her arms, blanket and all, pressing her cheek to his hot forehead. "Sister's here. Don't be scared. Sister's right here." He curled tighter, his small hand gripping her pajama top. The thermometer read 102.6. She went for the medicine, opened a bottle of water. And the bedroom door opened. Shinhanjo stood in the doorway in his pajamas, hair messy. His gaze swept over Sun Yin holding the medicine, then to Haoran's flushed face, and his brow drew tight. "Fever? Yes. Hi. Probably caught a cold." She dissolved the medicine in water and brought it to Haoran's lips. Half asleep, some of it ran down his chin. She dabbed it with a tissue, coaxing, "Come on, take your medicine. You'll feel better." Under her coaxing, he swallowed a little and curled back under the covers, but his hand still clutched her shirt. She couldn't move. She stayed on the edge of the bed, letting him hold on. Shinhanjo came over, felt Haoran's forehead, his fingertips lingering on that burning little face. Something that almost like tenderness flickered in his eyes. "You should sleep," he said. "I'll stay." She shook her head. "He's holding me. I can't leave. You go to bed. You've got work tomorrow." He didn't move. He went to the bathroom and came back with a cool cloth, handing it to her. She folded it over Haoran's forehead, felt the little boy's sigh of relief at the cool touch. The room fell quiet. Just Haoran's breathing and occasional mumbles. The night stretched. Sun Yin changed the cloth several times, took his temperature often. His fever finally broke a little around 3 in the morning. Shin Hanzhou had stayed the whole time, sitting on a chair at the foot of the bed, watching. Near dawn, Sun Yin couldn't keep her eyes open anymore. Her head kept nodding. She'd started sitting on the bed, but somehow ended up slumped over the edge, face in her folded arms, one hand still loosely holding Haoran's. Shin Hanzhou rose quietly, draped her fallen blanket back over her shoulders, and crouched beside her. He looked at her there, asleep in the gray dawn light filtering through the curtains. Her brow was furrowed, her lips pale from exhaustion. She was curled protectively around Haoran, like a tree planted in the wrong soil, but clinging stubbornly to life. That he reached out and very gently tucked a loose strand of hair from her face. His finger brushed her brow, and her lashes fluttered. She stirred. Sun Yin blinked groggily, meeting his face inches from hers. His gaze still rested where his fingers had been. He hadn't pulled back. They were close enough to share breath. She could see the red veins in his sleepless eyes, smell his familiar clean scent. What are you doing? Her voice was rough from sleep. His hand paused. Slowly, he withdrew. He looked away, his expression steady. But his ears were unmistakably pink. Your hair was messy. She looked down at herself, wrapped in a tangle of blanket, then at his red ears. Her sleepiness vanished. She opened her mouth, but a small, thick voice came from behind. Uncle, sister. Were you kissing? They sprang apart. Sun Yin sat bolt upright. Shin Hanzhou stood up so fast he stepped back a full pace. On the bed, Haoran had woken up, still flushed, but his eyes were clearer. Looking at them with a knowing little smile, Sun Yin's face went crimson. She reached for his forehead. Nobody was kissing. You're feverish. He let her fuss without resisting, but he chuckled, his voice still sleepy. I saw. Uncle's hand was on your face. That was him checking if I had a fever, Sun Yin said with entirely unconvincing authority, her ears trembling. Shin Hanzhou stood there, watching this chaos. He couldn't hold back the smile anymore. He turned his face away to cough. Nuan had woken up too. She padded in barefoot, climbed into Haoran's bed, and curled beside him, muttering, brother, before closing her eyes again. Sun Yin looked at the two children bunched together, then at Shin Hanzhou standing there, trying to hide his smile. It looked so much like a family of 4. The thought startled her. She stood abruptly, pretending to get a glass of water. As she passed him, she heard him murmur, too low for anyone else. I was going to kiss you. She stumbled, turned and glared at him, but her eyes betrayed her, full of fluster and unmistakable delight. He looked at her, ears even redder, but his smile deeper. Shin Hanzhou, shut up. She whispered. He made a sound of agreement. He shut up, but the smile went from his mouth to his eyes. Haoran's fever broke by afternoon. Kids recover quickly. By evening, he was playing blocks with Nuan in the living room. Sun Yin made a light chicken congee and brought it to him. He sat up and drank the whole bowl, then looked at her very seriously. Sister, he said, when are you two getting married? Sun Yin nearly dropped the bowl. Su Haoran, where did you hear that? I figured it out myself. He counted on his fingers. Uncle leaves water outside your door every morning. You put extra dates in his congee. Uncle holds your hand when he picks me up. Last night, you were holding him in your sleep. I was holding you. You were holding Uncle's wrist. I saw. She opened her mouth, but there was no arguing with a 7-year-old. She pinched his cheek. You little smarty pants. You just got better, and you're already worrying about this. Focus on getting well. He let her pinch, grinning with a row of white teeth. Looking pleased with himself, Sun Yin shook her head and carried the empty bowl out. In the hallway, she nearly collided with Shin Hanzhou. She didn't know how long he'd been standing there, but his dark eyes, falling on her pink face, held a clear, indulgent smile. Any congee left? He asked. She shoved the bowl into his hands. Get it yourself. Then she hurried away, feeling his gaze on her back like a brand. She closed her door, leaned against it, and patted her face. This family was doomed. Even a 7-year-old was pushing her to get married. When would Shin Hanzhou sooner or later actually happen? She couldn't wait for Haoran to learn to write wedding invitations first. She pulled out her phone, hesitated, and sent him a message. Haoran just asked when we're getting married. He replied fast. What did you say? She stared at the message. Her fingers hovered over the screen, typed and deleted 100 times. Finally, in a fit of self-destruction, she sent, I said ask your uncle. Then she buried her face in her hands. face down on the desk, pretending she hadn't said anything. About a minute later, her phone buzzed. A message from Shen Hanzhou. I'll tell him tomorrow in person. Su Nian stared at that message for a full 5 seconds. Then she clutched her phone and rolled twice across the bed. She sat up, hair wild, laughing and embarrassed at once. That you're such a jerk, Shen Hanzhou, she muttered, but the smile on her face lasted until she fell asleep. That night, as she passed Haoran's room, she heard Shen Hanzhou's low voice telling a story, but it wasn't about castles and princesses anymore. She pressed her ear to the door and caught fragments. And then uncle fell in love with sister. He thought she was the kindest person in the world. That Haoran's sleepy voice. And then he decided to tell her. But he was waiting for the right moment. What's a right moment? A pause. Shen Hanzhou's voice softened further. When she realized he was the right moment, Su Nian leaned against the wall outside, covering her face with her hands. She felt like she was burning from head to toe. She slipped silently back to her room, got into bed, and stared at the ceiling light for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and sent him 4 words. Right now is good. She threw the phone aside, buried her face in the covers, and waited to eye in the study down the hall. Shen Hanzhou was reviewing documents when his phone lit up. He saw the 4 words. The pen dropped from his fingers when no reply came for 3 minutes. Then 5. Then 10. Su Nian unearthed her phone from under the pillow. No new messages. She stared at the empty chat, her anticipation slowly giving way to anxiety, then to a creeping mortification. When she'd sent right now, her head had been buzzing. Like she'd downed half a bottle of liquid courage. Now the courage was fading, replaced by a screaming feeling of I was too forward. She shoved the phone back under the pillow and decided to sleep. But she couldn't. She tossed for almost half an hour before the phone finally buzzed. She flipped it open. Opened the door. Su Nian's eyes went wide. She scrambled out of bed, barefoot, and pulled the door open. Shen Hanzhou stood in the hallway in his dark gray loungewear, hair still slightly damp. Like he'd just showered. He held his phone, the screen lit, reflecting his faintly pink ears and his dark eyes in the dim light. He looked at her. 2 seconds passed. Then he said, your message. Is it what I think it means? She tightened her grip on the door handle, looking up at him. The way the hallway light caught his damp hair and straight nose. The way he was trying so hard to stay calm while his ears betrayed him. As she felt her nerves settle, she nodded. Yes, his Adam's apple moved. He stepped forward, reducing the gap to less than an arm's length. She could smell his clean scent mixed with aftershave. She looked up and didn't move away. Su Nian. His voice was lower than usual, careful and unsure. Say it again. She looked at the reflection of the hallway light in his eyes. And her own small reflection. She took a breath and said it again. Right now is good. You don't have to wait. She paused, her ears burning. But the words were already out. I already think you're the right moment. He closed his eyes. In that second, she saw his lashes tremble. When he opened them again, something in those dark eyes had finally settled, like the last icicle melting from a snowy roof, falling into spring mud. He reached for her wrist. His grip was gentle but sure, his thumb resting over her pulse, feeling the rapid beat. Su Nian. He said, tomorrow is Saturday. Come somewhere with me. She blinked. Where? You'll see when we get there. He released her wrist, but his fingers brushed the back of her hand on the way. A silent promise. Get some sleep. I'll come get you in the morning. He turned and walked away, his figure disappearing down the hall. Su Nian stood at her door, watching his back, then looked down at the back of her hand where his fingers had brushed. She closed the door, slid to the floor, and pressed her burning face to her knees, laughing. After a while, she crawled into bed, grinning, and finally closed her eyes. The next morning, Su Nian was woken by Uncle Chen knocking on her door. When she came downstairs, Shen Hanzhou was already waiting at the entrance. He was dressed more casually than usual. A dark gray turtleneck and black trousers, without a suit coat. She paused when she saw him, her heartbeat surging again. Let's go. He extended his hand. She looked at his open palm, hesitated 1 second, and placed her hand in his. He closed his fingers around hers. The warmth of their clasp seemed to radiate through her whole body. Haoran stood at the top of the stairs, watching their departing hands. He covered Nuan-Nuan's eyes. Don't look, sister. Not for kids. Nuan-Nuan pulled his hand away. I want breakfast. Shen Hanzhou took Su Nian to the beach. Almost 2 hours of driving, through suburban roads and open fields, until they reached a secluded stretch of sand. Late March wind still had a chill, but the sun was beautiful. shattering across the deep blue sea into 1,000 points of gold. He walked her to the water's edge, waves lapping at their ankles and retreating. She bent to roll up her jeans, then looked up to find him watching her. "Why did you bring me to the beach?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a dark blue velvet box. She stared at it, forgetting to breathe. Her eyes moved from the box to his face, from his jaw, tight with nerves, to his clear, serious eyes. "That I had several plans," he began, his voice half lost in the sea breeze, but every word reaching her. "Candlelit dinners, rooftop restaurants. I even thought about renting out a theater. But last night," he paused, "you said, right now is good." He opened the box. Inside was an elegant ring, a diamond on a platinum band, surrounded by tiny accent stones that caught the sun. "I thought, if right now is the right moment, there's no point waiting." He looked at her, the wind ruffling his hair. "Sun Yan, you took care of my family. You warmed that house. You made Haoran smile. You made Nuan feel safe enough to sleep." His voice dropped, the end a little rough. "Before you came, I never thought anyone would walk in. But you did. Every day." She pressed her lips together, her fingers trembling. The sea breeze stung her eyes. She blinked hard. "Oh, I told you. Sooner or later." He knelt on the soft sand, looking up at her. "Sun Yan, marry me. Not because of Haoran, not because of Nuan, because of you. Because that day at the translation site, when you crouched down holding Nuan, I thought, this is the person I want to keep. You take care of my family." He said, "I'll take care of you. For the rest of my life." She looked down at him on one knee. The wind caught his hair, and when he looked up, his eyes held the whole sky and sea. And her reflection. She remembered the first time she'd seen him, stern as ice, crouching before Haoran and softening his voice to ask, "What's your name?" She remembered all the water glasses, the letters, the way he shielded her from the relatives. The night he'd driven across the city and said, "I want to pick you up." Her throat closed. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Instead, she extended her left hand. He looked at it, and his smile slowly spread. He took the ring and carefully, reverently, slid it onto her finger. It was cool against her skin, snug and warm. She looked down at the ring, the sunlight making a tiny rainbow on the diamond. Then she looked up at him, still kneeling in the sand, and reached down to grab his collar and pull him up. He staggered to his feet, surprised. Before he could speak, she rose on her toes and kissed him. The wind gusted, tangling their hair. The sound of waves half drowned. She didn't hear any of it. Her lips were on his, and for a moment he went still. Then his arms tightened around her, pulling her close. His kiss was gentle, tasting of salt and sea and the relief of a long-awaited arrival. When she pulled back, breathless, she pressed her forehead to his. She laughed, her voice muffled against his lips. "Why didn't you reply last night?" "I waited almost half an hour." His arms were still around her. He looked down at her flushed cheeks and shining eyes, his smile the most open she'd ever seen. "Because I took a shower." A beat. Then she burst out laughing. "What did you shower for?" His ears pinkened. He looked away, toward the horizon. "I was too nervous. My hands were shaking." She laughed so hard she had to bury her face in his chest, her shoulders shaking. He held her, wrapping her closer, keeping the sea wind off her. When she finally looked up, eyes wet with laughter, she said, seriously, "Shinhanjo, I'll marry you." He bent and kissed her forehead. On the drive back, Sun Yin leaned against the passenger window, holding her left hand up to the light. The ring sparkled. Every 5 minutes, she'd twist it, making sure it was real. Shinhanjo kept glancing over at red lights, watching her play with it. That smile never left his face. "Like it?" he asked. She withdrew her hand and turned to him, trying to look serious. "It's fine, I guess. The size is okay." He looked at her. Clearly loving it, but pretending otherwise. He reached over and squeezed her fingers on the center console. "We'll get you a bigger one tomorrow." No. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers with his, resting them on the console. "This one is enough. It's your first gift. I'll wear it every day." His fingers tightened around hers. The light turned green, and he drove on. But that clasp never broke. When they arrived at the estate, Haoran and Nuan were already waiting at the door. Haoran ran out first, tiptoeing to peer into the car. When Shinhanjo opened the door, Haoran's eyes fell on Sun Yin's left hand. The sparkling ring made his eyes go wide. "Nuan," he called over his shoulder. "Uncle did it." Nuan toddled over, looking up with a blank expression. "Brother, what's did it?" Haoran crouched, holding her shoulders. "It means Uncle won't be alone anymore. Sister is our family now." Nuan blinked, then opened her arms to Sun Yin. Sister hold. Sun Yin bent and lifted her. The little girl's chubby arms circled her neck, and she whispered in Sun Yin's ear, "Sister smells nice." Shen Hanzhou stood nearby, watching Sun Yin hold Nuan while Haoran pulled her hand toward the house. The sunset stretched their four shadows long and tangled together. After a few seconds, he followed, slipping an arm around Sun Yin's shoulders. Haoran glanced back and smiled quietly. That evening, Uncle Chin set out 2 extra place settings and opened a bottle of Shen Hanzhou's vintage wine. "The master's happy, so I'm celebrating too," he said. Haoran couldn't drink, but he raised his juice glass and clinked it against Shen Hanzhou's, saying seriously, "Uncle, you have to treat sister well." Nuan echoed, "Treat well." Sun Yin sat beside Shen Hanzhou, her ring glittering in the warm light. She put a piece of spare rib in his bowl and found that he'd given her a piece of her favorite sweet and sour fish. They looked at each other, both at the same time, both red-eared, both pretending nothing had happened. Haoran sighed and shoved a spoon into Nuan's hand. "Eat, sister. Grown-ups in love aren't worth watching." The wedding was set for early summer. Shen Hanzhou planned it quietly but carefully. The venue was the garden behind the old Shen estate, where his sister Shen Qingtang had taken that photo on the swing. White roses and pale pink hydrangeas lined a red carpet aisle. At the end stood a white floral arch. A week before the wedding, Sun Yin stood in the garden watching the workers set up. A sudden wave of emotion hit her. Shen Hanzhou came up behind her, holding a freshly cut bouquet of white roses. "For you." She took it, buried her face in the blossoms, and breathed deep. When she looked up, her eyes were slightly pink. "Your sister loved these flowers, didn't she? I saw that photo." Her in the white dress on the swing, surrounded by white roses. He stood beside her, gaze fixed on the freshly painted swing. "A soft sound of confirmation," she said once. He said, "When she got married, she wanted it in the garden, covered in white roses." Sun Yin looked at his profile, the late afternoon sun falling on his shoulders. His lashes were lowered, his expression softer than usual. She touched his hand and said quietly, "Then this is for her too." He looked at her. He didn't speak, but he held her hand. On the wedding day, the weather was perfect. Sun Yin wore a simple white satin gown in oolong train. No heavy embroidery, just a fresh white rose pinned at the waist. At the garden entrance, Haoran stood beside her in a tailored little suit with a navy bow tie, his hair neatly combed by Uncle Chun. He looked up at her and said seriously, "Sister, you look so beautiful today." She crouched to straighten his bow tie. "You look handsome too. Handsomer than Uncle." He grinned. "Uncle looks handsome too. We're tied for first." He extended his small hand. "Come on, I'll walk you down the aisle." She took that little, warm hand, the other end. Under the white floral arch, Shen Hanzhou stood in a black suit, hair immaculate. His dark eyes, fixed on her across the garden full of flowers and guests, had lost all their coldness. He watched her approach, his smile growing. It was only a dozen steps, but it felt like forever. In her mind, she saw a rapid reel of images. The first time she'd met him crouched before Haoran, stern-voiced but tucking a blanket around Nuan. The water glasses, the midnight drive, the beach, kneeling in the sand, saying, "I'll take care of you." Then she reached the arch. Haoran solemnly placed her hand in Shen Hanzhou's and looked up at him. "Uncle, I'm giving you my sister." Shen Hanzhou looked at Haoran and pressed a hand to the back of his head. Then he took Sun Yin's hand, interlacing their fingers. All the guests were seated. The Shen relatives who'd once whispered about Sun Yin were clapping, some now smiling under Shen Hanzhou's calm gaze. Uncle Chun was wiping his eyes in a corner. The ceremony was simple. Vows exchanged, rings exchanged. Sun Yin's voice shook a little when she said, "I do." Shen Hanzhou's fingers trembled slightly as he slid the ring on her finger. Under the arch, they smiled at each other when the guests applauded. Nuan leaned out from her seat in the front row, arms out to Sun Yin. "Sister, hold." Shen Hanzhou bent and scooped Nuan onto his arm. In her little white dress, she perched on his elbow, curiously touching the flower on his lapel. Haoran ran up beside him. Under the white arch, the four of them stood together. Sunlight poured down, melding their shadows. From the guests, a young cousin whispered, "Uncle looks so gentle." "Is that really the same Shen Hanzhou?" Someone replied, "Look at how he's holding Nuan, more serious than signing a contract." Everyone knows he's completely wrapped around his wife and kids. Between photos, Haoran leaned close to Shen Hanzhou and said, just loud enough for Sun Yin to hear, "Uncle, Can I call you Dad now? Sun froze. Shin Hanzhou's arms tightened. He looked down at the little boy, who stared back with those almond-shaped eyes, just like his mother's, full of hope and a trace of worry. Shin Hanzhou's throat moved. You can call me anything. Haoran's grin broke wide. He went on tiptoe and tugged Shin Hanzhou's sleeve. Loud and clear. Dad. A beat of silence. Then Uncle Chun started clapping, and the guests burst into cheers and laughter. Shin Hanzhou shifted Nuan to one arm and crouched to Haoran's level, squeezing his cheek. Say it again, Dad. This time, Haoran's voice was stronger. He held his head high, laughing so hard his eyes became crescents. Shin Hanzhou pulled him into his arms, holding both children. He looked over at Sun Yan. She still stood there in her white dress, the wind catching the hem. Her eyes red but her smile huge. Come here, he said. She walked over. Shin Hanzhou couldn't free his hands, so he just bent and pressed a very gentle kiss to her forehead. Cheers and whistles from the crowd. Nuan clapped and laughed on Shin Hanzhou's arm. Haoran stuck his tongue out at Sun Yan from his father's arms. She blushed, gave Shin Hanzhou a little pinch at the waist, and whispered, in front of all these people. He looked down at her, his smile unstoppable. You're my wife? She looked into his eyes. Warm as sunlight. The face that used to be cold, that no one dared approach, was smiling at her without reservation. She let go of his waist and rested her forehead against his shoulder. After the reception, the four of them returned to the house. Uncle Chun had the living room waiting. Cake on the table. Nuan's favorite strawberries. Nuan was exhausted, asleep in Sun Yan's lap. Haoran was yawning but sat stubbornly beside Shin Hanzhou, holding a white rose from the wedding. Dad. He tested, finding the word very natural. He said it again, quietly. Daddy. Shin Hanzhou was peeling an orange. He paused at the second call, looking at Haoran. The little boy's eyes were already glassy with sleep, but he was still smiling. The white rose crushed in his hand. Yeah. Shin Hanzhou held a segment to Haoran's lips. Eat. Then bed. Haoran ate, his eyes falling closed as he chewed. Sun Yan started to carry Nuan upstairs. Shin Hanzhou took the little girl from her. I'll do it. You watch, Haoran. He placed Nuan on her bed, tucked in her favorite down comforter. She rolled over, clutching the edge, and mumbled, Good night, Daddy. Before sinking deep into sleep. He stood at the door, watching that tiny lump on the bed. The hallway light caught his profile, catching a sheen in his eyes. When Sun Yan came out of Haoran's room, she saw him still standing there. She slipped behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face to his broad back. Tired? She asked. He turned, pulling her into an embrace. His chin rested on her head. No liar, you were up until 3 last night. I saw you. His ears pinked. He didn't deny it. He looked down at her, smiling up at him, bent, and kissed the tip of her nose. I won't be up late anymore. Why not? Because you'll be here. Her face warmed. She pulled away, pulling his hand toward the stairs. Let's go. Big day tomorrow. Haoran has his enrichment class. He stopped her, on the steps, looking up at her. The nightlight softened his whole face. He gently took her hand from the banister, thumb stroking the ring on her finger. Sun Yan. Yeah. Thank you. She smiled at his serious expression. For what? His fingers tightened. He bent and pressed his lips to the ring on her finger. For everything 10 years ago. For bringing Haoran and Nuan to me. And, he looked up, for staying. Her eyes stung. She bent and kissed his forehead, then pulled him up the stairs. Come on, Shin Hanzhou. There's plenty of time for thanks. We have a lifetime. He let her pull him up 2 steps, then turned his hand to lace his fingers with hers. They walked the rest of the way like that at her door. She turned. Good night, Mr. Shun. He stood in the middle of the hall, moonlight slanting through the window at the end, catching his curved lips. Good night, Mrs. Shun. She smiled and closed the door. Behind it, she stood a moment, looking at her ring. She heard his footsteps recede toward his study. She pulled out her phone and sent 2 words. Love you. He replied quickly. Love you more. She fell onto the bed, laughing. Then she got up and went to the window. In the moonlight, the garden was still. The white roses shone pale in the dark. On the swing at the end, a bunch of white roses she'd placed there swayed gently in the breeze. She smiled toward them and whispered, Sister, don't worry. She closed the curtains, got into bed, and closed her eyes. She could feel the cool weight of the ring and the presence of the man in the next room. When she'd first come here, this house had been empty. Now it was full. She was full too outside. The moon still shone. In the house, for breaths slowly became one steady rhythm. like a lullaby with no words that's singing about his sister's love long ago, and a brother finally finding his way home, complete at last.